The cabin drifted in that heavy quiet only night flights know. Then the captain's voice broke through, urgent and sharp.
Anyone on board have real combat flight experience?
Heads lifted. Nervous eyes flicked around. No one understood why a call like that would ever be needed at 30,000 feet. In seat 8A, a woman stirred from sleep. Ordinary clothes, tired posture. People barely noticed her. But as the silence stretched, the uneasiness in the air kept growing. The quiet didn't last long after the captain's call. A member of the crew appeared in the aisle, moving with purpose, face set tight. They didn't explain what was wrong, but the tone said enough. Something wasn't responding the way it should. Something needed help fast. People straightened in their seats, eyes sharp with worry they tried to hide. A tremor of energy passed through the cabin, replacing the earlier calm with a restless edge. A tall man stood before anyone asked. He spoke quickly and confidently about flying small recreational planes years ago. His voice carried, and for a moment, a wave of relief rippled through nearby passengers. The crew listened, nodding, hope flickering on their faces. The man talked about runway landings and weekend trips, but his words never brushed what the captain had called for. When the crew pressed gently for specifics, his certainty thinned, excitement turning into apologetic hesitation. The cabin reacted with subtle disappointment, shoulders slumped, breaths dragged. Even without details, everyone felt how little time there was to waste. The crew thanked him and moved on, scanning seats for someone else, anyone else. The same question seemed to fill the air without being spoken. If not him, then who? A lingering silence answered back, stretching at the frayed edges of everyone's patience. Seat 8A watched quietly, hands still folded in her lap. Her eyes followed the crew as they searched, listened, and returned to the cockpit again and again. She could hear just enough scraps of conversation to know things weren't improving. A faint vibration under her feet seemed stronger than before, just a shade, but she felt it. The change tugged at her instincts the way an offbeat in a motor had always done. She pressed her palms together, feeling pressure gather inside her chest. The confident man who had stood up earlier leaned over to someone else and made another claim, softer this time, like he was trying to save face. Others nodded politely, eager for reassurance, even if it didn't have teeth. A few exchanged looks, concern growing behind forced smiles. Someone whispered about landing early. Someone else whispered back that landing wasn't the problem. The crew passed again, eyes scanning every row with growing urgency. The woman in 8A shifted slightly, but stayed silent. She could tell the issue wasn't something a recreational pilot could fix. It wasn't about steering or basic controls. She recognized that faint tremor under her shoes, the way metal groans when stress climbs from inside rather than outside. Years of listening to engines across docks and marinas had trained her ear, but explaining that to strangers in the sky felt impossible. She knew exactly how people reacted when a quiet woman claimed to know something they didn't expect. Passengers began asking crew members if they were sure everything was under control. The responses were polite but strained, carrying the weight of things unspoken. The crew didn't have answers ready, and that uncertainty spread through the cabin like a chill. The air felt thinner, as if even breathing had to wait its turn behind fear. She wiped her palms on her pants, eyes closing for half a second. Her thoughts moved quickly, checking every sound she could identify, analyzing the pattern that kept repeating beneath her feet. It wasn't random. It wasn't mild. Something was working too hard, and something else wasn't working enough. If she were back in her workshop, she would have already stripped the cover and found the imbalance. But here, surrounded by strangers who didn't know her, the math changed. Being right wasn't enough. Being believed was what mattered. Nearby passengers were losing patience. Someone asked loudly if the captain had anyone real to call. Another scoffed, blaming maintenance somewhere far away. Someone else declared that turbulence was the cause, even though the air outside was still. Opinions grew louder than facts, and facts grew harder to hear. The woman in 8A stayed focused on the vibration. It wasn't turbulence. It was internal rhythm, slipping out of alignment. The crew returned once more, pausing near her row, scanning faces again, deeper this time, like they finally understood the gap between what they had and what they needed. She met their eyes for a moment, then looked away. Her throat tightened. She could speak, she could raise her hand, she could explain what she felt with simple words, ones anyone could grasp, but doubt wasn't just in others. It sat inside her too, growing heavier each time she imagined being waved off. A child nearby asked if everything was okay. The parent gave a gentle smile that didn't reach their eyes. More passengers pressed call buttons. More questions rose. The crew tried to answer, but uncertainty twined through every sentence. The plane continued forward, steady enough for now, yet trembling faintly like a warning only a few could sense. Seat 8A exhaled slowly, listening harder. The vibration wasn't fading. It was growing in cycles, like a heartbeat skipping just often enough to be dangerous. She could predict what came next, at least in theory. She wanted to speak, but her voice felt trapped behind years of being brushed aside by louder, quicker mouths. Every second she hesitated, the pressure around her seemed to thicken. Passengers watched the aisle again, waiting for someone credible to stand. Anyone. Their eyes seemed to search every row for certainty, for authority, for someone who didn't flinch under the weight of responsibility. She felt all those eyes without them landing on her. She rubbed her fingers together, feeling calluses earned through long hours of hands-on work, the kind of experience that never looked impressive from the outside. The hum beneath her feet shifted once more, unmistakable now. She knew that change. She had recognized it a few minutes earlier, and now it was louder, closer to a threshold that couldn't be ignored. Her pulse quickened. She leaned forward a little, almost rising from her seat, but stopped short. Her breath caught in her throat. The question hung over everything, unanswered but growing sharper with every passing heartbeat. Would anyone step forward in time? And if she did, would anyone listen? The mood in the cabin shifted again, not as sudden as before, but steady and unsettling, like a shadow sliding across a sunny day. Lights remained dim, yet the brightness felt harsher now, revealing edges of worry on faces that had looked calm an hour earlier. The plane continued forward, but the hum beneath everything wasn't the same. It pulsed unevenly, a stutter that barely registered for most, but grew more obvious to those who paid close attention. A crew member returned with clipped steps, whispering into a handheld radio pressed close to their chin. Passengers leaned in without meaning to, drawn by tension even though they had nothing to add. Words couldn't be made out, only tone, firm, hurried, not yet panicked, but creeping toward it. The vibration under the woman's shoes deepened. It didn't shake, not violently, not enough to alarm the average person, but enough to confirm what she feared earlier. The problem wasn't static. It was getting worse in small, measurable steps. Someone in the row ahead lifted their phone, whispering about accessing manuals online. Others scoffed or nodded, unsure what to believe. Rumors began to form, short and sharp, bouncing down the aisle with nervous force. A few impatient voices rose, asking loudly for answers. The crew tried to settle everyone with polite firmness, but politeness frayed under the pressure of rising uncertainty. Then a low beep echoed from somewhere near the cockpit door, not loud, but unmistakable. Heads turned. The crew flinched slightly before masking reactions. That was enough to set fresh ripples through the rows, like pebbles dropped into still water. The unofficial discussions grew louder again, fueled by impatience and fear. People wanted concrete answers, but no one seemed willing to wait long enough to hear them. Instead, they filled gaps with assumptions. The woman in 8A listened to snippets of explanation from the crew that never quite answered anything. Everything is under control, fought against. We're assessing the situation in a losing battle. The passengers around her held onto both phrases at once because they needed reassurance, even if it didn't feel solid. Another beep, longer this time, followed by a faint change in cabin pressure. A loud voice from several rows back demanded that someone with real experience step up. They weren't shouting at anyone in particular, but the tone made it clear that a performance of confidence mattered more in that moment than verified capability. That demand pulled attention toward anyone who might look like they belonged in a command post. leaving the quiet woman in 8A even more invisible than before. She rubbed her fingertips along the seam of her pants, grounding herself. Under the hum of conversation and the sharper buzz of frustration, she could hear something else. The same rhythmic stutter she felt through her shoes, now reaching her ears. It repeated in intervals too regular to be random and too inconsistent to be healthy. She knew those inconsistencies well, the way machinery talked through vibrations before there was visible proof of strain. She opened her mouth once, intending a gentle suggestion to the passing crew, but another passenger cut in louder, pressing for answers before she could get a word out. Her voice faded under his, and the moment passed before she had time to recover. She leaned back in her seat, eyes stinging in quiet frustration. Doubt wasn't new to her. Still, sitting in silence while the problem multiplied felt worse than any workshop argument she'd ever endured. A second crew member returned with a small monitor in hand, reading data that only deepened the confusion. Passengers craned necks or leaned into aisles, hoping to understand. The readings changed faster than the crew could interpret them aloud. Numbers flashed, stabilized, dropped, then steadied again with no clear pattern. The uncertainty made everything worse. Every second stretched longer than the last. She strained to hear the rhythmic pulse again, isolating it beneath voices, beneath the floor's vibration, beneath clicking seat belts and tapping fingers. Once she separated the layers of sound in her mind, the pattern was unmistakable. It was the acoustic equivalent of a cough suppressed until it became dangerous. Something beneath them was struggling, working harder as efficiency slipped away. She sat forward slightly, heart beating faster from recognition and fear. Her instincts pushed her to act, to name the fault, to at least share what she sensed. But hesitation caught her again, heavier this time. Years of being overlooked didn't disappear overnight. A lifetime of hearing, let someone else handle it, sat on her shoulders like weighty hands. The wrong moment to speak could lead to nothing but dismissal, and time wasted might be more costly than silence. She swallowed hard, unable to decide which choice was worse. Someone near the front called out that they had handled emergencies before and offered generic advice. Their confidence filled the space more convincingly than facts. Passengers leaned toward them, subconsciously trusting the volume of their voice more than the content. Authority demanded proof now, not just claims. Verification was requested before access could be granted. But the louder passenger had nothing new to offer beyond tone and posture, and proof didn't follow volume. Meanwhile, the readings near the crew fluctuated more aggressively. The hum underfoot shifted again. The woman in 8A felt the vibration's length change, slightly longer, slightly deeper, another quiet signal of system strain. She knew if the pattern continued at this pace, the next shift would become noticeable to everyone, not just her. She pressed her palm to the armrest, grounding herself again. Her breathing tightened as she considered raising her hand. Just speak, she told herself silently. Say something before the next shift. But another passenger interrupted the crew again, insisting on being heard. She curled her fingers and lowered her hand halfway, caught between instinct and doubt, unable to break through the wall of louder voices. Someone muttered that the crew should just fix it already. Another suggested they were overreacting. Someone else whispered that the plane wouldn't be in the air if things weren't manageable. Each statement filled the silence with noise instead of clarity. The noise was easier to cling to than the truth no one wanted to acknowledge. Through it all, the woman in 8A felt the vibration repeat, each cycle a warning she recognized. The risk wasn't theoretical anymore. Whatever was failing was working harder now, clawing at the limits of what the system could handle. She knew if it continued shifting at this rate, the margin for safe correction would shrink to almost nothing. Her chest tightened again. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to listen better. Beneath the talking and breathing around her, beneath the clatter of tray tables and rustling clothes, the sound repeated with painful consistency. She counted the intervals silently. The timing confirmed her fear. Internal stress was climbing faster than anyone realized. Her pulse raced. She could help, she knew she could, but without proof in hand, her voice felt fragile. Verification was demanded of anyone offering help, and she didn't have printed credentials in her pocket. What she had were calluses, instincts, and years of hands-on experience. None of those, she feared, carried weight against louder voices backed by nothing more than self-importance. She gripped the armrest harder, breath shallow. If she didn't speak soon, the chance might slip away completely. The cabin waited for someone to take control, someone who could sort noise from signal, someone the authority could believe, but no one looked toward 8A yet. The minutes stretched, though no one dared check a clock. Time became measured instead by the tone of footsteps in the aisle, the clipped notes exchanged between crew members, and the tremors beneath the woman's feet that grew more pronounced. The rhythm was no longer subtle. It pulsed with a strained insistence, like a heartbeat starting to labor under pressure, and only those who truly listened could hear how close it was to crossing a line. A newer, sharper beep rang out, not long, but longer than before. It wasn't loud, yet it seemed to cut through every conversation mid-sentence. The sound held a warning even before anyone interpreted its meaning. The crew member holding the small monitor paused mid-stride, staring at the changing numbers. A faint crease formed between their eyebrows before they smoothed it away, as if control of their own expression could somehow restore control over the situation. Passengers noticed the hesitation. They didn't need technical knowledge to feel the mood shift. The air in the cabin felt charged, like static before a storm. A wave of murmurs followed the beep, some impatient, some anxious. People wanted certainty. Instead, they were offered reassurances that grew weaker with every repeated phrase. The woman in 8A felt the vibration again and again, subtle before, steady now, almost demanding attention. She counted the interval without meaning to, the way someone counts breaths in a moment of fear. Her instincts were louder than her doubts now. She leaned forward, turning slightly toward the aisle. She opened her mouth again, ready to speak before she could overthink. But once more, a louder voice interrupted. An assertive man, with a commanding presence, rose halfway from his seat, declaring that a landing should be arranged immediately, that no one else clearly understood what was happening. His volume was confident enough that several heads nodded without question. The crew listened just long enough to avoid offense, then requested more detail. What type of landing, what procedures, what risks? He didn't have answers. When pressed, he spoke vaguely, like someone who believed certainty was a replacement for knowledge. As his confidence crumbled, disappointment spread across nearby faces. Passengers looked away, deflated. The pressure didn't ease, it tightened. Hope flickered and failed again. The brief spike of energy that came with his rise burned out, leaving the space heavier than before. The woman in 8A clenched her jaw. She wanted to speak now more than ever, but the man's display made her hesitate. If someone with his volume and certainty fell apart under scrutiny, what chance did she have? Her voice was quieter, her demeanor more reserved. She imagined raising her hand, offering her reading of the vibrations, and being waved off before finishing a sentence. The thought strung, a familiar burn that made her chest tighten. A fresh round of notifications chimed from the cockpit area, short sequences of tones that suggested deeper analysis was underway. The plane's movement hardly changed, but that was what worried her most. She knew from experience that mechanical degradation could hide under a calm exterior until the moment it couldn't. The worst failures didn't always announce themselves loudly. Sometimes they whispered warnings until they ran out of time. Another passenger suggested broadcasting an open call again, louder this time, so no one could miss it. Someone else muttered that if anyone capable were on board, they would have stood up already. Those words landed like a stone in her gut. She swallowed hard and stared down at her hands, tracing old scars from years of work that shaped who she was, proof of experience no one here could interpret as valuable. The crew member with the monitor moved closer to her row, muttering numbers under their breath, counting intervals on their fingers. Their lips tightened as readings shifted faster than before. For a moment, they paused near 8A, eyes flicking her direction, almost as if sensing something in her posture. But before either could speak, Another passenger grabbed their attention with a loud declaration that mechanical failures simply didn't happen midair like this. The incorrect claim pulled the crew away again, the pair of eyes she needed turning elsewhere. She breathed out slowly, steadying herself. She knew that comment was wrong, not because she guessed, but because she had spent years fixing what broke in ways people didn't expect. Things didn't fail only through misuse. They failed through pressure, through time, through stress invisible to those not paying attention. Planes were no exception. Power didn't guarantee perfection, it only hid where until it didn't. A low tremor traveled up her legs again, more intense than before. She could feel it not only under her shoes, but in her bones, a deeper resonance that spoke of parts working against limits they weren't meant to cross. She knew the sound was only going to intensify. Every shift confirmed it. The degradation was accelerating faster than the crew's estimates. The rhythm she tracked wasn't random, it was a countdown. She straightened in her seat. Silence settled around her mind, clearing space for decision. She had been talked over once. She might be again. But silence wasn't safety anymore. Silence was risk. The urge to speak returned stronger, heavier, almost physical. But before she could rise fully, a new sound cut through the cabin, longer, lower, unmistakable. It wasn't catastrophic, not yet, but it was a line crossing. Heads turned instantly, including the crew. Their eyes darted across readouts, searching for correlation, for clarity, for anything that could anchor them. Passengers looked around in growing panic, trying to read faces for truth. Loud skeptics demanded answers again, stepping into the aisle, insisting on explanations. Their voices drowned the quieter ones, as always, filling the space with urgency and accusation instead of insight. She braced herself. If she waited any longer, hesitation might become regret. She lifted her hand, but before she could speak to the crew, a nearby skeptic raised their voice again, demanding that real expertise come forward and that random guesses be shut down. The crew, overwhelmed, turned toward the skeptic to calm the situation. Her hand stayed raised for several seconds until the attention drifted away again. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The vibration beneath her feet matched its rhythm, each pulse syncing with her growing dread. She wasn't wrong. She knew she wasn't, but knowledge wasn't what people trusted first. Confidence was, and confidence came easier to others than to her. Still, something shifted inside her. The fact she had raised her hand at all felt like the first step toward breaking through. Even if no one saw it yet, she felt it. The vibration confirmed it. The urgency breathing through her chest demanded it. She lowered her hand only halfway, fingers still curled upward, ready to rise again. The cabin's tension climbed near a brink where hesitation could no longer afford time, and somewhere beneath her feet, the next pulse of vibration gathered strength. A ripple of energy moved through the cabin when a new voice rose with confidence, stronger than the others, more assured, more controlled. A person near the front stood, projecting calm competence without hesitation. They claimed to have worked on specialized flight equipment in the past, speaking with a certainty that wrapped the worried passengers in temporary comfort. Their tone dismantled doubt the way warm light pushes back darkness. Heads turned toward them with renewed hope, and the tension thinned just enough for people to breathe deeper. Even the crew leaned forward, listening closely. The woman in 8A felt her pulse quicken, not in fear, but in anticipation. If this person truly knew what they claimed, perhaps the burden she felt could ease. She listened carefully to their brief explanation of what they planned to address. It wasn't entirely wrong, it just wasn't aimed at the root of the problem. The vibration beneath her feet didn't shift in response to their assessment. The rhythm was still there, repeating like a clock ticking down, but she said nothing. For now, it made sense to let others try, especially if they carried the confidence she struggled to show. The crew guided the volunteer toward the cockpit after verifying enough details to allow limited access. The sense of relief spread quickly across the cabin. A few people whispered encouragements, others leaned back, eyes closing for the first time since the tension began. Even she relaxed slightly, letting the moment breathe. The steady pulse of conversation softened into something hopeful. For a brief time, doubt felt distant. Authority transferred outward for the moment, and the passenger with confidence held it like a badge. Minutes passed. The hum under the cabin floor shifted slightly, smoothing just a bit. It wasn't perfect, nowhere near stable, but there was movement in the right direction. People noticed. Shoulders lowered, jaws unclenched. Someone sighed in genuine relief. Someone else joked weakly that they would still make their connection. The atmosphere brightened, thin but unmistakable. The woman in 8A allowed herself a single deep breath. Maybe, she thought, just maybe, this would hold. But patterns were her language, and this pattern refused to change enough to bring real comfort. The rhythm of the vibration had shortened, an improvement, but the intervals between pulses still drifted irregularly. It was like watching a candle flame steady for a moment, only to flicker harder after catching its breath. The temporary calm was doing what hope often does, papering over cracks that hadn't healed, just hidden. She pressed her fingers to her thigh, not out of nervousness now, but focus. A small alert chimed again, quieter than before, but differently pitched. Only a few heard it, but she did. The volunteer reappeared in the aisle, smiling, reassuring everyone that adjustments had been made. Their expression held confidence, but their eyes didn't quite match. Something in their gaze darted toward the cockpit once, lingering longer than expected. She recognized that look. It was the look of someone not entirely convinced by their own success. Still, the passengers applauded softly, hands tapping armrests or clapping gently, afraid perhaps that real applause would shake the fragile balance. She kept her hands still. The hum under her shoes didn't agree with the celebration. It was steadier for a moment, yes, but steadiness without consistency was only a pause, not progress. She listened harder, isolating the sound beneath the conversation. The timing wasn't right. It was too controlled, too forced, like pressure being managed instead of relieved. The brief optimism began to evaporate when the cockpit door opened once more and a voice relayed clipped information. Adjustments had slowed the problem, but not stopped it. Time was shrinking faster than anyone wanted to admit. Words like monitoring, temporary stabilization, and contingency options floated into the cabin, none of them reassuring. The volunteers' shoulders drooped ever so slightly as they returned to their seat. A few passengers stared, silently asking for reassurance that no one could give. She felt it again, the subtle shift in vibration, a tightening of the rhythm, not catastrophic yet, but unmistakably heading there. It was the same pattern she had learned to recognize long ago, the one that always came right before mechanical strain turned serious. She closed her eyes and counted silently with her pulse. The timing confirmed what her instincts already knew. The earlier improvement was temporary and the margin of safety was shrinking. Around her, the conversations shifted tone again. Hope bled into frustration. Frustration bled into dread. Some passengers blamed the volunteer for not fixing everything. Others said the crew should have done more earlier. Others fell into stubborn silence, refusing to show fear but unable to hide it. Authority moved back to the cockpit and cabin crew. Their voices regained command, though tinged now with urgency and fatigue. The volunteer had held authority briefly, but temporary solutions carried temporary power. The woman in 8A sat straighter. She didn't need charts or screens to confirm what she felt. But she also understood that unsourced certainty held little weight when compared to official protocol. Authority demanded verification, not intuition. She needed something that could be observed by more than her ears. So she watched for signs that others could see: the flicker of cabin lights, the faint rattle of an overhead compartment that hadn't rattled earlier, the way the air vents vibrated a fraction of a second longer before settling. All of it lined up with the rhythm beneath her feet. She inhaled deeply. She had evidence now, not written, not official, but visible enough to describe in practical terms. She could speak. She could point to something real. But the weight of doubt hadn't disappeared. It had just shifted shape. The authority that had briefly rested with the volunteer returned to the crew, and with it came renewed skepticism toward anyone without precise titles or documents. Voices rose again, demanding facts, demanding certainty, demanding clarity. She feared her voice might disappear under the noise once more. A new tone sounded from deeper in the cabin, longer, harsher, unfamiliar. Conversations stopped mid-word. Even the assertive skeptics grew quiet. The hum under her feet pulsed again, and she felt the interval shrink further. The pattern was nearly at its tipping point. Her instincts shouted louder than fear now. She sat forward, hands gripping the armrests. There wasn't much time left before the temporary calm gave way to something far harder to control. And still, no one was looking toward 8A. Silence held for a moment after the unfamiliar tone, the kind of silence that doesn't calm but tightens every muscle. The volunteers shifted in their seat, avoiding eye contact with those nearby. Whatever confidence they once carried seemed drained now, replaced by tired uncertainty. The brief relief they offered had slipped away, leaving the cabin more unsettled than before. Passengers looked at one another, searching for someone to blame or someone to believe, unsure which option felt safer. The woman in 8A listened as a faint ticking rhythm under the floor sped up, like metal tensing before it fails. She knew that sound. She'd heard it in engines that had been pushed too far, in systems holding together through force instead of balance. She brushed her thumb along her palm, a motion she always made when thinking through a mechanical problem. Every instinct in her said the same thing. The earlier fix had bought moments, not minutes. A new voice rose, someone near the middle rows insisting the issue wasn't mechanical at all, that everything was being exaggerated. Their certainty found willing ears, desperate for any explanation that didn't involve danger. They claimed the sounds were normal, that the volunteer had done enough, that people needed to relax. The woman in 8A listened closely. The argument was loud, persuasive, even comforting for those who feared the worst. But comfort wasn't accuracy. She felt frustration coil inside her. She didn't blame the passengers. Fear bends perception, but loud confidence without understanding was pushing recognition further away right when the stakes were rising fastest. Each wrong explanation delayed the moment when someone might listen to her. Time was shrinking, and authority still resisted anything not proven through official channels. The cockpit relayed more clipped updates into the cabin. This time the tone was sharper, the words less guarded. They admitted that options were narrowing. A reroute wasn't immediately available. Systems that should have stabilized were holding, but only barely. The situation hadn't improved enough to secure a smooth outcome. The volunteers' partial success now felt like a thin wooden plank across a widening gap. Passengers reacted with a mix of anger and fear. Some couldn't sit still, standing to stretch, as if movement could release anxiety. Others folded into themselves, arms wrapped tight, eyes darting between those who spoke loudest. The woman in 8A watched everything, absorbing shifting energy while her focus stayed anchored on the rhythm beneath her. It pulsed again, stronger, more insistent. The cadence shortened, the tone thickened. The point of no return was inching closer. She leaned slightly toward the aisle as a crew member passed, but once again, another passenger stepped forward first, this time with a theory about airflow issues. They spoke with assurance, convinced they had pinpointed a minor imbalance. The crew listened long enough to assess, then redirected them back to their seat. Authority didn't have time for claims without support, even confident ones. Yet their dismissal wasn't enough to clear space for her voice. It only increased frustration among those who felt unheard. The woman in 8A closed her eyes briefly and breathed out slowly. She needed something more concrete, something visual, something that wouldn't require passengers or crew to believe her instinct alone. She looked around for signs others could see. A row of overhead vents vibrated with a faint rattle barely perceptible unless watched closely. A fork on a tray trembled in sync with the floor's pulse. The lining near her shoes shifted with each beat, like a warning pressing upward. She pressed her shoe gently against the floor, feeling the vibrations directly, counting the exact rhythm inside her mind. The interval was collapsing faster now. Years of listening to engines told her the truth others missed. Whatever was failing was accelerating toward a point where control would become fragile. Once that threshold passed, recovery wouldn't be impossible, but it would demand more precision than anyone had demonstrated so far. Nearby passengers grew restless. Someone questioned why an expert hadn't been found yet. Someone else insisted that the crew must be hiding more details. The temporary volunteer sat rigidly, eyes fixed forward, avoiding every glance. Some passengers still believed in them, clinging to the memory of a brief improvement. Others doubted them now, blaming them for giving hope that didn't last. Tension split the cabin into factions of trust and distrust, none fully aligned with reality. The woman in 8A listened to every beat beneath her feet, letting it guide her thoughts. Hesitation was costing too much now. Confidence alone had failed once. Soon, the only thing that would matter was accuracy, and she had it, even if she didn't have the title people expected from someone who could help. She released a slow breath and prepared to stand. But just as she rose halfway, a sharp jolt rippled through the cabin, subtle, brief, but unmistakable. Gasps followed, heads turned. Even the skeptics froze for a heartbeat. It wasn't dramatic enough to induce panic, but dramatic enough to silence nearly every voice. The interruption proved something was shifting faster than before. She steadied herself, gripping the armrest to keep her balance. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but urgency. The vibration beneath her wasn't just consistent now, it was accelerating. The countdown she felt earlier was nearly visible. If someone didn't interpret the pattern soon, the window for safe correction would begin to close. The crew exchanged glances down the aisle, urgency carved into their expression now. Someone asked if anyone else had expertise to offer. The plea wasn't as commanding as before. It held a hint of desperation this time, a recognition that authority alone might not carry the solution. The woman in 8A drew a breath, ready again to speak. But before her voice could rise above the weight of the moment, a louder voice cut across the cabin, another self-assured claim, another theory, another barrier between her and recognition. She lowered her hand only an inch, not willing to give up, but forced to wait a fraction longer. The vibration pulsed again, sharper. The moment for hesitation was almost gone. A deeper tremor rolled through the cabin, not sharp enough to throw anything off balance, but strong enough that no one could pretend it was ordinary anymore. Conversations sputtered out mid-sentence. The movement was subtle, yet its meaning was clear. Whatever held the system together was running out of buffer. Even the loudest skeptics paused, sensing a threshold that didn't need technical language to be understood. The temporary calm born from earlier attempts was gone. In its place grew a heavy awareness that the situation had crossed into something undeniable. Crew members moved faster now, but with measured restraint. Orders passed between them quietly, heads close, hands steady. They coached their own expressions into neutrality for the passengers' sake, but tension showed in their shoulders, in the speed of their steps. The plane still held steady in the air, yet the feeling beneath everyone's feet had changed from nuisance to warning. The hum was no longer background, it was foreground, unavoidable. The woman in seat 8A sat forward, her palms resting lightly on her knees. She tracked the rhythm underfoot, not just as sensation, but as evidence. Each pulse matched a pattern she had learned over years of repairing engines pushed beyond intended limits. She waited for a crew member to pass close enough. When they did, she spoke, not loudly, not with desperation, but with clarity that had no wobble in it. She described the resonance pattern she heard, the timing between pulses, the way each cycle shortened, and what that usually meant in a mechanical system approaching stress failure. Her words were technical but simple, grounded in physical cues rather than jargon. She didn't claim knowledge beyond what she could sense herself. She didn't lead with titles. She led with observation. The crew member paused, eyes narrowing first with caution, then curiosity. They didn't accept her claim outright. They couldn't, not with protocol in place, but they asked her to repeat herself slowly. She did, without hesitation. A brief silence surrounded them, broken by the persistent hum beneath everything. The crew member jotted a few notes on a handheld device, then asked her to wait while they checked something. Passengers nearby watched, not sure whether to trust what they saw. The loud skeptic in the neighboring row scoffed under his breath, but said nothing else. The earlier jolt had shaken his confidence too. Moments later, two crew members returned with a small readout display. They didn't hand it to her, not yet, but they held it where she could see. She pointed gently to a drifting value that matched her timing count. Without touching the device, she explained how the inconsistency lined up with the vibration pattern. One crew member tested her theory with a limited adjustment from the cockpit. A few seconds later, the vibration underfoot shifted exactly as she predicted, just slightly, but enough to prove correlation. Passengers didn't cheer this time. They barely breathed. The cabin held collective air as crew exchanged glances with tightened jaws. The confirmation wasn't absolute, but it was real, a micro-validation. Authority didn't crumble, protocol still stood, but it bent, even if only a little. The woman in 8A didn't smile or celebrate. She stayed still, letting the evidence work on its own. She knew from experience that pushing too hard, too soon, could fracture fragile trust. Instead, she waited as the crew processed what had just happened. One of them asked her to clarify the pattern again. She spoke steadily, repeating the count, the interval, the implications. No embellishment, no urgency. Just facts grounded in what everyone could feel beneath their feet. Another controlled adjustment followed. Again, the mechanical rhythm responded just as she described, not fixed, not solved, but understood. A second micro-confirmation. Something shifted in the space between her and authority, not a full transfer of control, but an opening, a recognition that the path forward might require her insight. Passengers watched her now, not with full trust, but with sharpened interest. Her voice didn't shake, her posture didn't shrink. She wasn't loud, yet she held attention through steadiness alone. Skeptics remained skeptical, but they grew quieter with each passing second of validation. She asked calmly whether she could see the remaining diagnostic readouts. Not everything, just specific indicators that would confirm the timing she tracked. Authority hesitated. That hesitation held weight. Giving access would mean acknowledging her role. The crew stood between protocol and necessity, caught in a moment where one more confirmation could decide whether she stayed a bystander or became instrumental. Eyes drifted toward her seat, not questioning anymore, but waiting. And still the barrier hadn't lifted yet. The vibration pulsed again, louder under her shoes. The stakes hovered at their peak, and silence surrounded her request. The silence stretched long enough that passengers felt it. Not a total hush, but a held breath. Conversations reduced to whispers, movement reduced to stillness, every sound framed by the deeper vibration pulsing underneath. Authority stood in place, weighing something invisible, measuring risk against reputation, instinct against protocol. The hesitation didn't come from doubt in her words anymore, but from the barrier of procedure built long before any of them boarded this flight. She kept her gaze steady, not pleading, not demanding. The weight of the moment was real, but she carried it without shaking. She had asked for access to specific readouts, nothing more. The data she needed wasn't restricted for secrecy, only guarded for control. Authority wasn't afraid of what she might see. They were afraid of what acknowledging her insight might imply about everything that had come before. The crew exchanged glances down the aisle, urgency carved into their expression now. Someone asked if anyone else had expertise to offer. The plea wasn't as commanding as before. It held a hint of desperation this time, a recognition that authority alone might not carry the solution. The woman in 8A drew a breath, ready again to speak. But before her voice could rise above the weight of the moment, a louder voice cut across the cabin, another self-assured claim, another theory, another barrier between her and recognition. She lowered her hand only an inch, not willing to give up, but forced to wait a fraction longer. The vibration pulsed again, sharper. The moment for hesitation was almost gone. A deeper tremor rolled through the cabin, not sharp enough to throw anything off balance, but strong enough that no one could pretend it was ordinary anymore. Conversations sputtered out mid-sentence. The movement was subtle, yet its meaning was clear. Whatever held the system together was running out of buffer. Even the loudest skeptics paused, sensing a threshold that didn't need technical language to be understood. The temporary calm, born from earlier attempts, was gone. In its place grew a heavy awareness that the situation had crossed into something undeniable. Crew members moved faster now, but with measured restraint. Orders passed between them quietly, heads close, hands steady. They coached their own expressions into neutrality for the passengers' sake, but tension showed in their shoulders, in the speed of their steps. The plane still held steady in the air, yet the feeling beneath everyone's feet had changed from nuisance to warning. The hum was no longer background, it was foreground, unavoidable. The woman in seat 8A sat forward, her palms resting lightly on her knees. She tracked the rhythm underfoot, not just as sensation, but as evidence. Each pulse matched a pattern she had learned over years of repairing engines pushed beyond intended limits. She waited for a crew member to pass close enough. When they did, she spoke, not loudly, not with desperation, but with clarity that had no wobble in it. She described the resonance pattern she heard, the timing between pulses, the way each cycle shortened, and what that usually meant in a mechanical system approaching stress failure. Her words were technical but simple, grounded in physical cues rather than jargon. She didn't claim knowledge beyond what she could sense herself. She didn't lead with titles. She led with observation. The crew member paused, eyes narrowing first with caution, then curiosity. They didn't accept her claim outright. They couldn't, not with protocol in place, but they asked her to repeat herself slowly. She did, without hesitation. A brief silence surrounded them, broken by the persistent hum beneath everything. The crew member jotted a few notes on a handheld device, then asked her to wait while they checked something. Passengers nearby watched, not sure whether to trust what they saw. The loud skeptic in the neighboring row scoffed under his breath, but said nothing else. The earlier jolt had shaken his confidence too. Moments later, two crew members returned with a small readout display. They didn't hand it to her, not yet, but they held it where she could see. She pointed gently to a drifting value that matched her timing count. Without touching the device, she explained how the inconsistency lined up with the vibration pattern. One crew member tested her theory with a limited adjustment from the cockpit. A few seconds later, the vibration underfoot shifted exactly as she predicted, just slightly, but enough to prove correlation. Passengers didn't cheer this time, they barely breathed. The cabin held collective air as crew exchanged glances with tightened jaws. The confirmation wasn't absolute, but it was real, a micro-validation. Authority didn't crumble, protocol still stood, but it bent, even if only a little. The woman in 8A didn't smile or celebrate. She stayed still, letting the evidence work on its own. She knew from experience that pushing too hard, too soon could fracture fragile trust. Instead, she waited as the crew processed what had just happened. One of them asked her to clarify the pattern again. She spoke steadily, repeating the count, the interval, the implications. No embellishment, no urgency. Just facts grounded in what everyone could feel beneath their feet. Another controlled adjustment followed. Again, the mechanical rhythm responded just as she described, not fixed, not solved, but understood. A second micro-confirmation. Something shifted in the space between her and authority, not a full transfer of control, but an opening, a recognition that the path forward might require her insight. Passengers watched her now, not with full trust, but with sharpened interest. Her voice didn't shake, her posture didn't shrink. She wasn't loud, yet she held attention through steadiness alone. Skeptics remained skeptical, but they grew quieter with each passing second of validation. She asked calmly whether she could see the remaining diagnostic readouts. Not everything, just specific indicators that would confirm the timing she tracked. Authority hesitated. That hesitation held weight. Giving access would mean acknowledging her role. The crew stood between protocol and necessity, caught in a moment where one more confirmation could decide whether she stayed a bystander or became instrumental. Eyes drifted toward her seat, not questioning anymore, but waiting. And still the barrier hadn't lifted yet. The vibration pulsed again, louder under her shoes. The stakes hovered at their peak, and silence surrounded her request. The silence stretched long enough that passengers felt it. Not a total hush, but a held breath. Conversations reduced to whispers, movement reduced to stillness, every sound framed by the deeper vibration pulsing underneath. Authority stood in place, weighing something invisible, measuring risk against reputation, instinct against protocol. The hesitation didn't come from doubt in her words anymore, but from the barrier of procedure built long before any of them boarded this flight. She kept her gaze steady, not pleading, not demanding. The weight of the moment was real, but she carried it without shaking. She had asked for access to specific readouts, nothing more. The data she needed wasn't restricted for secrecy, only guarded for control. Authority wasn't afraid of what she might see. They were afraid of what acknowledging her insight might imply about everything that had come before. One crew member finally nodded, a small gesture, but heavy with meaning. They didn't hand over the display outright, but they positioned it within her view, an inch closer than before. It wasn't full access, but it was permission to guide them. She leaned forward, studying the values as they rolled across the small screen. The numbers weren't stable, they drifted with each cycle, confirming the internal strain she'd sensed long before anyone else listened. She didn't take long. She pointed to two readings that rose and fell out of sync, explaining how the pulse beneath their feet matched the gaps between those metrics. Her voice stayed quiet, but the crew leaned closer to hear. She traced the rhythm through the data without touching the display, showing cause and effect through logic alone. A crew member whispered into their radio, relaying her interpretation to the cockpit. The reply came back quickly, short, clipped, acknowledging correlation. Passengers nearby caught fragments of the exchange. Their eyes widened slightly, not in full understanding, but in dawning awareness. Authority still held control, but its grip had changed. They were no longer searching blindly. They were testing her insight under pressure. Her presence, once overlooked, now occupied a space the cabin couldn't ignore. Another micro-adjustment came from the cockpit. It wasn't dramatic. The cabin didn't tilt. Nothing shook loose. But the undercurrent beneath her shoes shifted again, aligning more closely with the intervals she had identified. She felt the change travel up her legs like a confirmation, subtle but real. One of the crew exhaled quietly, as if they'd been holding breath without noticing. The vibration wasn't fixed. It wasn't safe. But for the first time, it responded predictably. Authority began to defer just slightly. Questions that had been directed broadly to the cabin now filtered toward her. Yet every deference came wrapped in caution, as if each step toward trust risked stepping over protocol's edge. They didn't announce her role, didn't invite applause, didn't signal surrender of hierarchy. Instead, they shifted posture, angling their bodies toward her seat, listening without admitting they were listening. She asked again, calmer this time, for a specific series of readouts. The crew hesitated once more, not out of disbelief, but because fully honoring the request meant crossing the threshold between cautious acknowledgement and direct reliance. Their eyes flicked between her, the monitor, and the cockpit door. The hum from below filled the pause with quiet urgency. The passengers sensed the turning point, even if they didn't understand it. A single crew member stepped closer, lowering the handheld device so she could see additional data. Not full access yet. Not complete trust, but another inch, another crack in the barrier. The gesture was small, but its weight pressed on everyone, not just those watching, but those responsible for decisions. She read the new stream of information in seconds, her eyes flicking between numbers, matching patterns against what she felt through the floor. She didn't smile, she didn't sigh, she simply nodded once, as if confirming something to herself. Then she looked up and stated clearly what the readings meant. The time frame to intervene was shrinking faster than estimated, but still existed. If handled precisely, authority froze, absorbing the implication. The passengers around them sensed the meaning through tone alone. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry out. They went quiet in anticipation, waiting to see if the moment of acceptance had finally arrived. The vibration pulsed again, steady, insistent, undeniable. Eyes turned toward the crew, eyes turned toward her. The final barrier stood between understanding and action, and the silence just before it broke felt heavier than the hum beneath their feet. The pause before authority responded felt longer than it was, stretched by the tension in every breath. Then, finally, the crew member holding the display gave a short nod, not dramatic, not loud, but unmistakable. It was permission, and more than that, acknowledgement. They asked her to guide them through a specific sequence of checks. She didn't stand or rush forward. She stayed seated but straightened, voice steady, as she outlined what to monitor first. Authority didn't hand over full control, but they gave her enough influence to steer. Information flowed quickly now. Another crew member relayed her instructions through their radio, translating each suggestion into technical shorthand the cockpit could act on. She listened to the response through brief transmissions, matching each adjustment against the vibration beneath her feet. This time, her focus narrowed entirely on the rhythm, less on people, less on judgment, more on timing. She counted intervals silently as she guided small countermeasures, slight redistributions, a shift in output, controlled load balancing. Nothing grand, just persistent nudges in the right direction. Passengers watched the exchange with bated breath. Some leaned closer, others sat stiffly, hands clenched on armrests. The loud skeptic in the middle rows didn't speak now. Confidence had finally given way to uncertainty. And the temporary volunteer, who once held hope, stared ahead quietly, absorbing the shift in authority. No one openly admitted it, but everyone knew who the cabin's center of gravity had become. The first adjustment took effect, a subtle change barely perceptible to most, but she felt it. The vibration under her shoes hesitated, then resumed at a slightly longer interval. Not fixed, but slowed. It wasn't enough to calm the cabin, yet it was enough to signal possibility. A crew member studied the new readings, eyes widening just a fraction. They didn't say anything yet, but their posture changed, less guarded, more attentive. She didn't celebrate. Instead, she gave the next instruction, this time with more precision. The cockpit acknowledged immediately. Again, she listened to the rhythm beneath her. The vibration changed again, this time responding with a smoother cadence. A second shift, consistent with her expectation. Someone nearby whispered, noticing the subtle difference in the cabin's feel. The skeptic flinched, as if bracing for something, but nothing jolted. The crew leaned closer to her now, not crowding, but respecting. Their eyes met hers as though confirming she was prepared for continued guidance. She didn't flinch. She asked for a new set of readouts, specific data points she had identified earlier as crucial. Authority hesitated only a breath before lowering the display further, widening her view. She processed numbers rapidly, then instructed the next countermeasure with calm certainty. This adjustment took longer to register, but when it did, the floor's feedback softened again. The hum wasn't gentle yet, but its irregular stutter began to fade. The structural tension still existed, but it was no longer accelerating toward crisis. Stabilization, not recovery, but control, was forming under her direction. A quiet exhale rippled through the nearby rows. Not relief yet, but the edge of it. Crew members exchanged looks, no longer asking whether she knew what she was doing, but how far her insight could take them. A different energy filled the cabin now, anticipation layered over fear. Passengers didn't trust fully, but they trusted enough to hope again. She guided another small adjustment, explaining how each change affected the load distribution. Authority didn't challenge her. Instead, they mirrored her language, repeating instructions through technical phrasing that matched cockpit communication. Her words moved through the hierarchy like current through wire, flowing from calm observation to action. The vibration beneath her flattened further, now more rhythm than alarm. Her shoulders relaxed just slightly, only enough for her to breathe more freely. She didn't label the moment success, only progress. Authority echoed her restraint, keeping outward expressions measured. But hesitation gave way to focus, and doubt gave way to execution. One remaining set of indicators flickered on the display, shifting too fast to interpret at a glance. She requested a controlled test. Authority relayed. The cockpit responded, the cabin waited, seconds felt thick. The vibration dipped lower, steadier still. The once chaotic pulse now hummed in a pattern she recognized as controlled strain, dangerous if ignored, manageable if respected. For the first time, Authority turned fully toward her seat, waiting for next steps. She wasn't done, but now she led. The question wasn't whether she could guide them. The question was whether the balance she restored would hold long enough to carry them to safety. The moment Authority shifted their stance fully toward her, the cabin's atmosphere changed. No announcement marked the transition, but everyone felt it. Passengers sat straighter, conversations died off, and the hum beneath the floor seemed louder in the silence. She asked for one more set of readings, this time with emphasis on values that reflected stress distribution rather than raw output. The display hovered within her sight, and she tracked every fluctuation while the crew relayed her guidance. She waited for the pulse under her shoes, counted the interval, then signaled a precise countermeasure. The cockpit confirmed. A controlled adjustment followed. The hum softened again, lengthening its rhythm another fractional beat. She nodded once, eyes fixed forward. Authority didn't question, just readied to execute more of her instructions. For the first time, the collaborative chain between her perception and their control functioned smoothly, without doubt clogging its flow. The vibration no longer felt like a countdown. It felt like a negotiation, one she was winning through patience and precision. Passengers sensed the change even without understanding it. The once fidgeting skeptics sat frozen, hands clasped tight, watching her instead of the crew. The temporary volunteer shifted with mixed relief and regret, aware of their own limits, but quietly grateful someone else could do more. She guided another adjustment, but this one required timing. She listened closely, eyes half closed, tracking the engine's breath through the floor. When the pulse hit its narrowest point, she gave the signal. Authority relayed instantly. The cockpit acted. The vibration dipped, abruptly at first, then settled into a steadier pattern. Pressure redistributed. Systems that had strained on the edge regained controlled tension. One crew member read the updated metrics aloud, voice nearly breaking with contained relief. She didn't react outwardly. Instead, she asked for confirmation of a specific value she couldn't see. Authority checked, then nodded. Her interpretation aligned perfectly. It wasn't victory yet, but it was competence undeniable. The barrier that once silenced her had shifted into trust, carried by necessity. Passengers glanced at her now with quiet admiration, not the loud applause of triumph, but the silence of respect growing at its roots. The loud skeptic pressed lips together, looking away when her gaze passed briefly over their row. The volunteer lowered their eyes, not ashamed, but humbled. The air felt clearer, though turbulence still lived beneath the surface. She requested another controlled redistribution, smaller now, more of a refinement than a repair. The cockpit acknowledged with the same urgency, but not the same panic. She waited through the adjustment, assessing how the hum changed. When the next pulse came, the irregularity was gone. The vibration followed a predictable pattern, neither smooth nor dangerous, stable enough to navigate. Authority finally spoke with new tone, not commanding, not defensive, but aligned. They asked what else was needed. She gave instructions that focused on maintaining balance rather than restructuring it. She wasn't trying to fix everything, only ensuring that what remained could hold until they reached a safer position. Every word reflected experience that didn't need titles to validate. Systems across the aircraft began to respond in ways passengers could feel. The tension in the floor lessened. Loose items no longer rattled with each pulse. Breath came easier, though no one dared exhale fully. The worst wasn't over, but the freefall of fear had slowed into controlled descent. The hum of engines, once a source of dread, became an anchor, steady, rhythmic, trustworthy once again. She finally leaned back an inch, her posture no longer rigid. Not relaxed, just centered. The crew stayed close, waiting for her next cue, listening for any sign that the vibration might shift again. The cabin held its collective breath, not in panic, but in anticipation of endurance lasting long enough. Authority now followed her guidance with precision, while she relied on their execution to carry out her strategy. The balance of control was shared, but her insight remained at the core. The system hadn't healed, it had stabilized enough to move forward. Passengers didn't know how close they'd come to losing control, but they knew who held it now. The engines hummed beneath her shoes, steady enough to trust, but not yet guaranteed to hold. The question lingered in every heartbeat. Would her approach last long enough to reach safety? The wheels met the ground with a muted thud, steady enough that most passengers didn't flinch. No loud announcement marked the landing as extraordinary. The captain kept the tone even, thanking everyone for cooperation and patience. The aircraft slowed along the runway, braking with control that felt almost calm after everything that came before. A few people let out shaky breaths, only then realizing they'd been holding tension in their shoulders for far too long. Relief settled over the cabin, not rushing in, but arriving slowly, as if unsure whether it was allowed to stay. She stayed seated, hands resting lightly in her lap, listening as the engines wound down. The vibration beneath her didn't disappear, it transformed into something familiar, harmless, routine. The rhythm held none of the urgency she had followed so closely. It was simply the sound of a machine at rest after surviving strain. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the steadiness wash over her. It wasn't pride she felt most strongly, but release, a quiet acknowledgement that the danger had passed because action met timing. The seatbelt chimes sounded. Passengers shifted in their rows, eager to stand yet cautious, as though movement might break the fragile balance of calm. She didn't rush. She waited as others stood first, pulling bags from overhead compartments and brushing past one another with forced politeness. A crew member approached her row slowly, pausing near her shoulder. They didn't speak loudly, didn't ask for attention. They simply leaned close enough that only she could hear the quiet words of acknowledgement. No flourish, no praise, just recognition spoken with sincerity that didn't need repetition. She responded with a small nod. The crew members' eyes lingered a moment longer, then moved on, maintaining the rhythm of post-landing duties. Another member of the team passed by soon after, their expressions softened with something like gratitude. They didn't break protocol, but their posture shifted in a way she could read, the kind of change only noticed by someone who knew what it meant to hold responsibility under pressure. The aisle filled slowly. The temporary volunteers stood near the front, adjusting a strap on their bag with deliberate care. They looked her way only once, offering the faintest smile, small but genuine, like someone who understood the difference between trying their best and finding someone who could do more. She returned the gesture with grace. There was no victory to claim between them, only respect earned through effort. The skeptic who once spoke the loudest hesitated as they passed her seat. They didn't meet her eyes at first, focusing instead on the floor or the overhead bins. But just before moving forward, they paused, fingers tightening briefly on the handle of their bag. The slightest turn of their head followed, barely a glance, yet heavy with meaning, not an apology spoken aloud, not a statement of regret, but an acknowledgement through silence. She didn't need words. Their hesitation said enough. Other passengers offered small nods, some subtle, some hesitant, each one shaped by the lingering memory of how doubt had given way to reliance. A few mouths opened, as though forming sentences, but none of them seemed to find the right phrasing. The moment didn't call for speeches. Respect wasn't loud here. It moved in quiet gestures, lowered eyes, softened voices, and the absence of objections. She stepped into the aisle when space cleared, carrying only a modest bag that looked worn from years of use. Her posture remained calm, neither drawn inward nor inflated by what had happened. The crew stood near the exit, greeting passengers as they disembarked. When she reached the door, the same crew member who had lowered the display met her gaze again. Their expression held gratitude layered under professionalism. No announcement followed, no crowd turned. But in their eyes, she saw recognition that could never be undone. Outside the aircraft, the air felt cooler, lighter. She walked along the jet bridge with even steps, feeling the contrast between the confined cabin and open walkway. The hum of distant airport machinery blended into a soundscape she didn't need to interpret. No vibration demanded her attention now. She exhaled slowly, realizing how deeply she had carried tension through her body, even after the crisis had eased. Passengers ahead walked briskly, eager to leave the experience behind. Some slowed as she approached, offering quiet nods or brief moments of eye contact. No one spoke loudly. The respect in their silence held more weight than words could. Former doubters didn't recast themselves as believers, they simply stepped aside, letting her pass without obstruction. Silence became acknowledgement, not avoidance. In the terminal, life continued without pause. Screens displayed flight times. Voices echoed from distant gates. Rolling suitcases clicked against tile. The world outside the cabin knew nothing of what had nearly unfolded. She didn't need them to know. The validation she received was enough. Not applause, not ceremony, but the genuine shift from doubt to trust shared within a small community of witnesses. She paused briefly, hand resting on the strap of her bag, letting the noise of the terminal flow past her like wind through open space. She didn't search for recognition. She didn't wait for someone to call her name. The journey she completed wasn't about being declared a hero. It was about being seen clearly after being overlooked for so long. Somewhere behind her, more passengers emerged from the gate. A few glanced her way, sharing brief nods before moving on with their days. No one interrupted. No one demanded explanation. Silence became the final word, respect spoken without sound. She walked forward with steady steps, not carrying the moment as a burden, but as a quiet truth. Competency had prevailed, and doubt had dissolved without needing to be defeated. Whether recognition stayed private or someday became public didn't matter now. Her dignity was restored, and silence, for once, said everything. The message reached her later, long after she had left the terminal and returned to the quiet rhythm of her own life. It arrived without ceremony, not as a public announcement or formal commendation, but as a private note from someone whose authority had once stood between her voice and recognition. The words were brief, but they carried weight. Gratitude, acknowledgement, and something rarer, respect that didn't need witnesses to feel real. She read it twice, not because she doubted the meaning, but because the sincerity in the phrasing landed gently, like something earned through effort rather than asked for. She placed the message down and let the silence in the room settle. The memories of the flight didn't rush back in dramatic flashes. They returned in quiet fragments, the hum beneath her feet, the steady counting in her mind, the moment doubt shifted into trust. Nothing about the experience felt larger than life now. It simply felt true, like a moment that confirmed what she already knew. Her capability was not defined by who saw it. In the days that followed, life continued as it always had. People she passed on the street didn't know what she had done. Cashiers didn't recognize her. Neighbors didn't stop her with stories they'd heard. Her world remained ordinary, but something within her felt steadier. The recognition she received hadn't needed to be loud to matter. It had reached her directly, without filter or hesitation, proving that silence didn't always hide dismissal. Sometimes it held respect. Now and then, she thought of the passengers from that day. She imagined how some might still remember the way the tension dissolved after the landing, how others might have replayed the moment authority leaned toward 8A instead of turning away. She didn't expect them to speak of her, but she knew in small gestures they already had. A nod, a glance, a shift in posture, silent acknowledgments that said what words might have complicated. She stepped outside one evening, breathing in the calm air, feeling the steady ground beneath her feet. No vibration demanded her attention now. The world was quiet, but not empty. She carried recognition with her, not as something she needed others to confirm, but as something she no longer doubted. Her worth was no longer overlooked. And that truth stayed with her, strong enough to stand without a sound.